good evening, and welcome back to Lamplight History. I'm Henry, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. Wherever you are and whatever kind of day it has been, you can lay it all down now. There is nothing more to do and nowhere else you need to be. Make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. Close your eyes if you wish. I will take care of the rest. Tonight, we are going to travel back almost 2,000 years to a bright and busy little city by the sea on the last ordinary morning of its life. Its name was Pompeii. And for a long and happy while, it was one of the most pleasant places to live in all the Roman world. It was a town full of sunlight and wine and laughter, of bakers and bankers and fishermen and slaves, of grand houses and painted walls and crowded streets. And then, in a single day and night, it vanished from the face of the earth, buried alive, and was very nearly forgotten for 1,700 years. And yet, because of the very disaster that destroyed it, Pompeii became something no other place on earth has ever quite become. A whole town, a whole world, caught and held in a single moment of time, and kept almost perfectly for us to find again. To walk its streets today is to step, as through a magic doorway, straight into an ordinary day in the ancient world, and to meet the people who lived it, not as dusty names in a history book, but as living men and women, with all their loves and labors and small human dreams. This is its story told slowly and gently, from the living city to the silence that followed, and on, at last, to its wondrous waking. There is nothing you need to remember tonight. There is nothing you need to do at all. Simply let the words carry you, like a slow boat on a calm sea, down and down towards sleep. So let us go back to the south of Italy, to a wide and beautiful bay of blue water, in the year 79 after the birth of Christ. This is the Bay of Naples, one of the loveliest coastlines in the whole of the ancient world. The sea is warm and clear. The air smells of salt and pine and flowers. And along its shores lie scattered a string of prosperous towns and villas, where the rich and the ordinary alike come to enjoy the gentle climate and the fertile land. This was, in truth, one of the most fashionable and beloved coastlines in all the Roman world, a place of holiday and pleasure and ease. The wealthiest families of Rome, and even the emperors themselves, kept grand seaside villas here, where they escaped the heat and the noise of the capital to rest among the vines and the olive trees, looking out over the blue and sparkling bay. It was a coast of good wine and warm sea and long lazy afternoons, a corner of the world that seemed especially blessed by the gods, where life was sweet and slow and kind. And of all the pleasant places along that shore, few were pleasanter than the busy little town that sat almost at the foot of the great green mountain. Above it all rises a great green mountain, tall and broad and peaceful, its slopes covered in vineyards and orchards and dark woods. The people call it Vesuvius, and they love it, for its soil is rich and black, and grows the finest grapes for their wine. What not one of them knows, what no one alive so much as suspects, is that this quiet green mountain is not a mountain at all. It is a sleeping volcano, and its sleep is almost over. But that is still to come. For now, the mountain dozes in the sun, and at its foot, near the shore, sits the town of Pompeii, going busily about its life. It is not a large place as cities go. Perhaps 15 or 20,000 people live within its walls. But it is rich and lively and comfortable. It sits just inland of the sea, beside a river, a bustling little port where goods flow in and out, and money changes hands, and life is good. A strong stone wall rings the town, pierced by grand gates through which the roads run out into the countryside. Inside, the streets are laid out in a neat grid, paved with great blocks of gray volcanic stone, worn smooth and rutted by the wheels of 1,000 carts. And crossing those streets, here and there, are raised stepping stones, so that on rainy days a person might cross without wetting their feet in the water and mud that runs along the gutters. Let us walk into the town, then on this last ordinary morning, and see it as it was, alive and warm and utterly unaware. It is early. The sky is pale gold over the rooftops. The first light is touching the tiled roofs and the tops of the temple columns. And the city is beginning to wake, as it has woken every morning for hundreds of years, with no reason at all to think that this morning is any different. The first to stir are the bakers. All over town, in dozens of little bakeries, the fires are being lit beneath the great domed ovens. Slaves turn the heavy millstones, grinding grain into flour, round and round, as they have since before dawn. The smell of wood smoke drifts through the narrow streets. And soon another smell joins it, the warm, comforting smell of fresh bread baking, round flat loaves marked into wedges that will be sold still warm from the oven. The shopkeepers are opening up. All along the main streets, the fronts of the shops fold back to reveal counters open to the road. There are cloth merchants and lamp sellers and cobblers and jewelers and workshops where the sound of hammering has already begun. And on the walls beside the doorways, painted in red and black, are notices and advertisements, and here and there the scribbled graffiti of ordinary people, jokes and names and lovers' messages that would one day speak to us across the centuries. The streets are filling now. A crowd is gathering, flowing toward the heart of the town. Here comes a wealthy man in a fine white toga, followed by his slaves. There, a woman with her hair carefully dressed, carrying a parasol against the coming heat. Farmers drive carts of vegetables in from the countryside. Children dart between the legs of the crowd. A stray dog trots along the gutter. It is an ordinary, wonderful, living morning. Let us follow the crowd to the very center of the town, to the great open square that is the beating heart of Pompeii. It is called the Forum. It is a long rectangle of open paving, surrounded on all sides by tall columns and grand public buildings, gleaming white in the morning sun. This is where everything happens. Business and politics and worship and gossip, To be in Pompeii and never come to the Forum would be like never leaving your own house. At one end rises the grandest temple of all, the Temple of Jupiter, King of the Gods, its high steps and towering columns looking out over the whole square. And behind it, framing the view, stands the green mass of Vesuvius itself, looming over the town, so familiar that no one even sees it anymore. Around the square stand statues of emperors and local heroes on tall pedestals, gazing down with blank marble eyes upon the crowds below. The Forum is thronged with people. Merchants strike deals. Politicians make speeches. Friends embrace and stop to talk. Along one side runs the great covered market, the Macellum, where you can buy meat and fish and fruit and every good thing. Step inside it and your senses are overwhelmed at once. Here are the fishmongers, their slabs bright with the morning's catch from the bay, the scales glinting, the smell sharp and salty. Here are the butchers and the sellers of fruit and vegetables heaped in baskets, figs and grapes and apples and greens. Here are stalls of cheese and honey and eggs and live birds in cages and every good thing the rich land around could give. In the center, beneath a little round roof, a fountain played, where the fish were cleaned, and the scales and bones of thousands of fish would one day be found still lying in its drain. And all around the market and the square swirled the endless business of the town. Pompeii was not only a place of pleasure, but a place of hard work and trade. It was a great center for the making of wool and cloth, and the workshops of the fullers, who cleaned and finished the cloth, were among the richest businesses in the town. Bankers lent money and kept accounts. Merchants struck deals over cargoes of wine and oil and garum. Guilds of tradesmen gathered to talk and to dine and to look after their own. Money changers sit at their tables. Public notices are read aloud. The noise of 1,000 voices rises and echoes off the marble. This is the sound of a city fully, gloriously alive. Off to one side stands the Basilica, the great hall of law and business, where judges hear cases and merchants settle their accounts beneath a high and splendid roof. Nearby are the temples of other gods, of Apollo, and of the goddess of the town, and small shrines where people pause to whisper a prayer and leave a coin or a little offering. For these are deeply religious people, who see the hand of the gods in everything, in every harvest, every voyage, every birth and death. Their gods were many, a whole great family of them, each with their own powers and their own temples. Jupiter, the king of heaven, and Juno his queen, and Venus, the goddess of love, who was the special protector of Pompeii itself. Mars, the god of war, and Mercury, the god of merchants and travelers, much loved in this trading town. And a host of smaller gods besides, for every stream and doorway and crossroads. But their faith was not only a thing of grand temples. It lived, above all, in the home. In the corner of nearly every house in Pompeii stood a little shrine, a lararium, painted with images of the household spirits, the Laras, who watched over the family and its fortunes. Each day the family would pause there and offer a few words and a little food or wine or incense to the small gods of their own hearth, asking their protection for the day ahead. There were festivals, too, all through the year, days of holiday and feasting and sacrifice, when the streets filled with processions and beasts were offered upon the altars, and the smoke of the sacrifice rose up to please the gods. And there were newer faiths creeping in from the far corners of the empire, above all the worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis, with her mysterious rites and her promise of life beyond death, whose fine temple in Pompeii was one of the busiest in the town. On this last morning, as on every morning, the people made their small offerings and whispered their small prayers and asked the gods, as they always had, to keep them safe and their families well and their town prosperous. They do not yet know that their gods are about to fall silent. Let us leave the forum now and wander the side streets and see how the people of Pompeii eat and drink and live. On almost every corner stands a thermopolium, a kind of ancient fast food shop. Its counter faces the street, set with great clay jars sunk into the stone. Inside those jars are kept warm foods and drinks, stews and lentils and spiced wine, ready to be ladled out to the hungry passerby. For many ordinary people who had no kitchen of their own, this was where they ate their daily meals. Step into one of these little shops. The walls are brightly painted. The counter is worn smooth by years of leaning elbows. A customer stands eating from a bowl, throwing scraps to a dog. The owner ladles hot food from the steaming jars. Coins clink upon the counter. It is warm and noisy and smells of garlic and wine, an utterly ordinary scene, repeated 10,000 times, on this and every other morning of the town's long and comfortable life. The people of Pompeii were great lovers of good food and drink. In the countryside all around grew olives and grapes and figs and wheat. Their wine was famous, pressed from grapes grown on the rich slopes of Vesuvius itself, and sold in jars all across the region. And they had a peculiar passion, one that would seem very strange to us, for a strong, salty sauce made from fermented fish, called garum, which they poured over almost everything, and which was made in great vats along the coast. Pompeii, in fact, grew rich in part upon this humble fish sauce, which was shipped from its harbor to markets far across the empire, and a certain merchant of the town made a great fortune from it, and was proud enough to have the very jars of it painted upon the floor of his fine house. For this was a busy trading town, its harbor crowded with ships, taking in the goods of the whole Mediterranean world, fine pottery and spices and cloth and slaves, and sending out its wine and its oil and its garum in return. The tables of the rich might groan with delicacies, with roast meats and shellfish and dormice fattened for the purpose, and sweet cakes rich with honey. The poor ate more simply of bread and porridge and beans and whatever the season gave. But rich and poor alike lived in a land of astonishing plenty, blessed by the sun and the sea and the wonderful black soil of the mountain that would one day destroy them. Let us step now into one of the bathhouses, for the baths were the very center of Roman daily life, far more than a simple place to wash. A visit to the baths was a ritual and a pleasure and a social event, where a person might spend hours of the afternoon among friends. There were several sets of baths in Pompeii, warm and steamy and richly decorated, open to rich and poor alike for the smallest of coins. Inside, you would move slowly from room to room as the temperature rose. First a warm room to gently open the pores. Then the hot room, thick with steam, its floor and walls heated from below by hot air flowing through hollow spaces, a clever Roman invention. There you would sweat and talk and be scraped clean, for the Romans used no soap. Instead, they rubbed their skin with oil and then scraped it away, along with the dirt and sweat, using a curved metal tool called a strigil. And then, at the last, the plunge into the cold pool, gasping and laughing, to close the pores and refresh the body. All around, the sound of voices echoed off the vaulted ceilings, men doing business, exchanging news, boasting and joking, slaves attending their masters. Outside, in the exercise yard, young men lifted weights and wrestled and played ball games in the sun. The baths were the town's living room, and everyone, from the grandest to the humblest, passed through them. And they were places of great beauty, too, these bathhouses, for the Romans lavished art and care upon them. The ceilings were molded with fine white stucco, worked into little figures and patterns. The walls were painted, and the floors laid with mosaics of sea creatures and gods. Warm light fell through high windows into the steam. It was a small daily luxury, a taste of splendor, open to nearly everyone, for the smallest of coins. And around the bathers moved a whole little world of attendants and hangers-on. There were slaves to guard the bathers' clothes, though thieves still slipped in, and one piece of graffiti curses whoever stole a bather's tunic. There were masseurs to knead the tired muscles, and sellers of oils and perfumes, and vendors crying their snacks and their drinks through the crowd, sausages and cakes and cups of wine. There was the constant echoing din of it all, the splashing and the shouting and the laughter and the slap of hands on wet skin, ringing off the vaulted ceilings. A person might come to the baths in the early afternoon and not leave until evening, having exercised and bathed and been oiled and scraped and massaged and done a little business and heard all the news and gossiped with half the town. It was leisure and hygiene and society, all rolled into one warm and steamy ritual. And on this last afternoon, as on every other, the baths of Pompeii were full of people, warm and clean and content, with no notion at all of what the evening would bring. Now let us see where the people of Pompeii lived. And here the town shows us its two faces, the face of the rich and the face of the poor. For the wealthy, there were grand and beautiful houses, turned inward away from the noisy street, quiet and cool and private. You would enter through a plain door and pass into a bright central hall, open to the sky in the middle, with a shallow pool set in the floor to catch the rain. This central hall was called the atrium, and it was the proud heart of the home. Its walls were painted with glorious scenes in deep reds and golds and blues. Beyond it lay the private rooms, and then, at the back, a beautiful enclosed garden, ringed with columns, planted with flowers and fountains and shade. Here the family would dine on long couches, reclining as they ate, served by slaves, entertained by music, looking out over their green and peaceful garden. It was a life of great comfort and quiet good taste. The floors of these fine houses were laid with mosaics, tiny pieces of colored stone fitted together into pictures, some of them of astonishing beauty and skill. In the doorway of one house, a mosaic showed a fierce dog on a chain, with the words, "Beware of the dog," a warning as familiar then as it is now. The grandest house of all was so large and splendid that we call it the House of the Faun, after the little dancing statue that stood in its garden. It was a palace fit for a prince. But most of the people of Pompeii did not live like this. Most were ordinary folk, tradesmen and workers and slaves, who lived crowded together in small rooms above and behind the shops. Their lives were harder and plainer and lived largely out of doors, in the streets and the squares and the baths and the taverns. Slaves, who did much of the work of the town, had no real home of their own at all, and no freedom, though a fortunate few might one day earn or be granted their liberty. For this was a world built upon slavery, as all the ancient world was. It is a hard truth, but a true one, and we should not look away from it. The beautiful houses, the fine meals, the leisure of the baths, all rested upon the labor of men and women who were owned and bought and sold like furniture. They cooked and cleaned and carried and toiled in the workshops and the fields, and their names mostly are lost to us forever. But they too were people of Pompeii, and they too were there on that last morning. And what of the women and the children whose world this also was? The women of Pompeii lived, as women did throughout the Roman world, lives more bounded than the men's, centered upon the home and the family. A respectable wife ran the household, oversaw its slaves and its stores, spun and wove its cloth, and raised its children. And yet some women here rose far beyond that. We have met already the freedwoman who paid for great public buildings, one of the richest and most honored people in the whole town, her name carved in stone for all to see. Women owned businesses and property and made their voices heard in a world that did not always expect it of them. The children of Pompeii played, as children always have, with dolls and marbles and little clay figures, with hoops rolled along the street and games of knucklebones in the dust. Those of well-off families were schooled, taught their letters and their numbers, sometimes by a learned slave in the household, sometimes by a teacher who held his noisy little class in the corner of the forum, under the open sky, cuffing the ears of the inattentive. On the walls, here and there, a child's clumsy first attempts at the alphabet still survive, scratched into the plaster nearly 2,000 years ago. And when the people fell ill, as people do, there were doctors who set bones and mixed medicines and performed even delicate surgery with fine bronze instruments, sets of which have been found in the town, gleaming and sharp and terribly familiar. They knew nothing of what we know, and much that was mistaken, and yet they cared for the sick and the injured with such skill as they had, in a world without any of the comforts we take for granted. It was, in all, a life recognizably like our own in its shape, its work and its rest, its schooling and its sickness, its raising of children and its burying of the old, all of it going quietly on that last ordinary morning. Let us return to the streets, for the streets were where Pompeii truly lived. They were narrow and loud and endlessly full of life. The walls along them were covered in painting and writing, layer upon layer, like an ancient and chaotic message board. There were election notices urging citizens to vote for this man or that. There were advertisements for shows. And there were the scribblings of ordinary people that survive to this day. And what did they write, these people so long dead? The same things, more or less, that people have always written. Lovers wrote the names of their beloved. Someone boasted of a fine meal. Someone else complained about an innkeeper. A schoolboy practiced his letters. A weary soul wrote simply on a wall that he was surprised the wall had not yet fallen down, holding up so many boring messages. Above all, they wrote of love, for the young of Pompeii were forever in love and forever writing about it. Marcus Loves Spendusa says one wall simply. Another cries out, "Cruel Lalagus, why do you not love me?" One lover writes, tenderly, that lovers are like bees, in that they live a honeyed life. Another declares that nobody is elegant unless he has loved. And two friends left a note together that reaches straight across the centuries. "We two dear companions were here," they wrote, "and if you wish to know our names, they are Gaius and Aulus." And now and then, among all the love and the laughter, someone wrote something quieter and sadder and wiser. "Once you are dead," wrote one soul upon a wall, "you are nothing." He meant it, perhaps, as a reason to enjoy life while it lasts. He could not have known how soon, or how completely, his own bright town would be proven right, and then, against all his expectation, be remembered forever after all. Across nearly 2,000 years, in these small foolish words scratched on plaster, we hear them laugh and love and grumble exactly as we do. There were taverns, too, on many corners, where working men gathered in the evening to drink cheap wine and roll dice and play at games of chance. The paintings on the walls of one such tavern show the customers doing exactly that, drinking, flirting, and quarreling over a game, until the landlord throws the brawlers out into the street. It is a scene so human, so timeless, that you can almost hear the shouting and the laughter across the centuries. Pompeii had its theaters as well, where crowds gathered in the open air to watch plays and pantomimes, comedies and tragedies, beneath the blue Italian sky. There was a large theater for grand performances, and a small covered one for music and poetry, their curved stone seats rising in tiers, as they still do today. On the great stage they watched comedies that made them roar with laughter, and old tragedies of gods and heroes, and, most beloved of all, the mimes and the pantomimes, where masked dancers told whole stories with nothing but the movements of their bodies. The finest of these dancers were famous across the empire, adored like the greatest stars of our own age, their names, once again, scrawled admiringly upon the walls. And this reminds us of the shape of an ordinary day in Pompeii, for it was a life that knew how to enjoy itself. The Romans rose early and did their serious work, their business and their law and their trade, in the cool of the morning. But the afternoon belonged to leisure, to the long, unhurried ritual of the baths, to exercise and gossip and rest. And the evening belonged to pleasure, to the dinner party above all, where friends reclined together for hours over many courses and much wine, with music and conversation and laughter, late into the warm and starlit night. The people took great delight in their entertainments, in spectacle and story and song, in gathering together in the warm evening to be moved and to be amused. But of all their entertainments, none stirred the blood of Pompeii like the games of the amphitheater. And here we come to the great oval arena on the edge of the town. It was one of the oldest stone amphitheaters in all the Roman world, able to hold perhaps 20,000 spectators, very nearly the whole population of the town. Here, on days of games, the people packed the stone tiers under the blazing sun, to roar and cheer and gamble, and to watch men fight, and sometimes die, for their entertainment. For this was the age of the gladiators, those trained fighters, most of them slaves or prisoners, who battled one another with sword and shield and net and spear upon the sand. There were different kinds of them, each with their own weapons and their own way of fighting, and the crowd knew them all and had their favorites, and argued fiercely over which kind would win. One might carry a large shield and a short sword, another a net and a trident like a fisherman, another fight almost bare, trusting to speed. It was a deadly art, and a spectacle, half sport and half sacrifice, and the people of Pompeii could not get enough of it. A day at the games followed a set and savage order. In the morning came the hunting of wild and exotic beasts, brought at great cost from the far corners of the empire. At midday, in the worst part of the show, came the public execution of condemned criminals. And in the afternoon, the main event, the gladiators themselves, marching out in their gleaming armor to the sound of trumpets, to fight and sometimes to die before the roaring crowd. The crowds adored them. The finest gladiators were famous men, their names scrawled admiringly on the walls, sighed over by the women of the town. One piece of graffiti calls a certain fighter the man the girls sigh for. And though most gladiators were slaves or prisoners with no choice in their fate, a few free men actually chose the life, for the fame and the glory and the roar of the crowd, gambling their lives for a moment of adoration. There was a barracks in Pompeii where the gladiators lived and trained, and where their weapons and armor would one day be found, still waiting in the ash. The people of Pompeii were so passionate about their games that, some years before our story, they had caused a great and bloody scandal. During a show in the amphitheater, a brawl broke out between the people of Pompeii and visitors from a neighboring town, Nuceria. It exploded into a full riot with knives drawn and many killed and wounded. So serious was it that the emperor himself, far away in Rome, banned all games in Pompeii for 10 long years as a punishment. A painting of the riot survives, showing the fighting spilling out around the arena. Let us leave the arena now and meet, before we go on, a few of the real people of Pompeii, whose names have come down to us across the ages. There was a banker named Lucius Caecilius Iucundus, a wealthy moneylender whose records, written on wax tablets, survived in his strongbox, telling us of the deals and debts of the town. His portrait bust was found in his house, a shrewd, warty, smiling face, utterly individual, gazing out at us across 19 centuries. There was a rich freedwoman, a former slave who had won her freedom and grown wealthy, and who paid for public buildings out of her own purse, her name carved in stone in gratitude. There were bakers whose loaves survive, blackened but whole, still stamped with their maker's name. There were painters and doctors and priestesses and politicians. There was a wine seller whose name was painted on his jars. There was a garland maker weaving flowers for the day's festivals and feasts. There were perfumers and goldsmiths and cobblers and weavers, each bent over their morning's work. There were politicians out among the crowds, shaking hands and asking for votes, for the elections were near. Somewhere a bride was perhaps being dressed for her wedding day. Somewhere a mother nursed a newborn only days old. Somewhere an old man sat in the sun outside his door, watching the town go by as he had watched it for 70 years. And there were countless others whose names we will never know, the children and the slaves and the poor, the vast ordinary multitude of a living town, all of them going about this bright late summer morning. And over all of them, that morning, loomed the great green mountain, Vesuvius, as it always had. But the mountain was not, in truth, as peaceful as it seemed. For the earth beneath the Bay of Naples had been restless of late. And if the people had known how to read the signs, they might have been afraid. But they did not know. For no one then understood what a volcano was, or that Vesuvius had ever been anything other than a quiet and generous mountain. The warnings had, in fact, been coming for years. 17 years before, there had been a great earthquake, which had shaken Pompeii terribly, cracking walls and toppling temples and columns. The town had been rebuilding ever since. Even on this last morning, all over Pompeii, there were scaffolds and repairs, buildings half mended, the marks of that old wound still healing. The people had taken it as a natural misfortune and set about the repairs and thought little more of it. They did not understand that the earthquake had been the mountain, stirring in its sleep. And in the days and weeks before this morning, there had been smaller signs, had anyone known to fear them. There had been little tremors, small shakings of the ground, so common in that region that no one paid them much heed. The wells and springs had begun, strangely, to dry up. Some later said that the animals had grown uneasy, restless and afraid, in the way that animals sometimes are before a great disaster. But to the people it was just another warm summer and another ordinary day. So the morning wore on, bright and hot and blue, like 1,000 mornings before it. Let us hold this last peaceful hour in our minds for a moment before everything changes. the bakers drawing their bread from the ovens, the crowds thronging the forum, the bathers in the steam, the children in the streets, the ships in the harbor, the gladiators at their practice. An entire living, breathing, ordinary world going about its small and precious business with no idea at all, that this was the last morning any of them would ever see. Somewhere in the town, a woman does her hair before a bronze mirror. In a fine house, a family sits down to a late breakfast of bread and fruit and cheese. In a bakery, 81 loaves of bread are placed into an oven to bake, and the door is closed upon them. They will not be taken out again for 1700 years. In the house of the faun, in the villas, in the crowded upper rooms, in the taverns and the workshops and the temples, life goes gently, unknowingly on. And out in the bay, across the water, at a naval base called Misenum, a famous old gentleman sits reading and making notes in the sun. His name is Pliny, a great scholar and admiral, one of the most learned men in all the Roman world, endlessly curious about nature and its workings. He and his young nephew who is staying with him will become our witnesses this day, the only voices that will describe from the outside the thing that is about to happen. Remember them. We will return to them soon. For now, though, all is still calm. The sun climbs toward noon. The shadows shorten. The heat lies heavy over the red-tiled roofs of Pompeii. Somewhere a temple bell sounds. A cart rumbles over the paving stones. A vendor calls out his wares. A child laughs. And deep beneath the green and pleasant mountain, in the dark heart of the earth, a vast and terrible pressure, building for centuries, is at last about to break free. Let us take one last, slow walk through the living town and say a gentle farewell to it as it was. Down the paved main street, past the fountains where the water still splashes and gleams. Past the open shops and the painted walls and the little shrines on the corners. Past the forum and the temples and the baths and the theater and the great silent arena. Past all the works and days of these long-vanished people, standing warm and whole in the noonday sun. Picture the fountains at the street corners, where all day long the people came with their jars to draw fresh water, brought into the town along great stone channels. For Pompeii was a town of running water, a marvel of Roman cleverness. Fresh water was carried from the distant hills along an aqueduct, and into a great tower in the town, and from there through pipes beneath the streets, to public fountains on the corners, to the baths, and even to the private homes and gardens of the rich. On every quiet street you could hear it, the soft and endless music of water splashing in the stone basins, day and night, without cease. Picture, too, the harbor, just beyond the walls, where the masts of the ships stood thick against the sky, and the goods of the whole known world were loaded and unloaded upon the quays. The smell of the sea and the tar and the fish, the calling of the sailors, the creak of the ropes, the little boats coming and going upon the bright water of the bay. And picture the land all around the town, the rich green country climbing toward the mountain, patterned with vineyards and olive groves and farms and fine country villas, where the wealthy escaped the summer heat. The roads ran out from the town gates into that green land, and, as was the Roman custom, they were lined on either side with the tombs of the dead, so that the living passed the resting places of their ancestors each time they came and went. The dead kept the roads of Pompeii, watching over the comings and goings of the living, on that last bright morning as on every other. Picture the little household shrines in every home, where each family honored the small gods that watched over their hearth and their food and their safety. Picture the gardens behind the high walls, heavy with late summer fruit, humming with bees, the fountains playing softly in the shade. All of it warm and living and about to end. And picture the people one last time. The baker sliding his loaves into the oven. The rich man reclining at his meal. The slave drawing water at the fountain. The gladiator resting in the cool of the barracks. The mother singing to her child. The dog dozing in a patch of sunlight in a doorway. Hold them there for a moment in the warm light of that last noon. For they did not know, and there was no one to tell them, and there was no longer any time. It is now around midday on an August afternoon, or perhaps some now believe a day in October in the year 79. The exact date has been debated, but the hour matters more than the day. It is early afternoon. The town is full. The people are at their meals or their business or their rest. And upon the mountain, high above the town, the ground begins very slightly to tremble. At first, perhaps, it is nothing. A shudder. A rattle of cups upon a shelf. The people of that region were used to such things and thought little of them. But this tremor does not fade. It grows. The ground begins to shake in earnest. Somewhere, a jar falls and shatters. A startled bird takes flight. People pause in the streets and look at one another. Something is not right. Something is building. And every eye begins slowly to turn toward the mountain. And then, with a roar that would be heard for 100 miles, the top of Vesuvius blows apart. Centuries of pent-up pressure, of molten rock and superheated gas trapped beneath a plug of ancient stone, burst free in a single, catastrophic instant. The whole summit of the mountain is blasted into the sky, and up, faster than the eye can follow, rises a monstrous column of smoke and ash and stone. It climbs with terrible speed, straight up into the clear blue sky, higher and higher, miles into the air, until it flattens out at the top and spreads. Far across the bay at Misenum, the old scholar Pliny's nephew would later write that the great cloud looked exactly like a tree, a vast umbrella pine, with a long trunk rising up and branches spreading out at the top. It was a thing no living person had ever seen or had any name for. It rose over the doomed town like the hand of an angry god. In Pompeii, the people stand frozen in the streets, staring up in terror and wonder at the impossible thing growing in the sky above them. For a few moments, perhaps, there is only awe and a dreadful silence, as the shadow of the great cloud begins to fall across the town, and the sunlight starts to fail. And then, from high above, the sky itself begins to fall. And the last day of Pompeii truly begins. So here we will pause and let the bright noon fade, and let the rest of this story unfold in the gathering dark, while you drift down toward sleep. There is no need to stay awake for what comes next. The tale will go on softly, gently, whether your eyes are open or closed. Let it become a quiet voice in another room. The living city is behind us now. The mountain has spoken, and the long night of Pompeii is about to fall. Rest now and let it come. So the great cloud climbed into the summer sky, and the shadow of it began to fall across the land. Tonight, in the gentle dark, we will follow that long and terrible day and night to its end. There is nothing you need to do but listen, and breathe, and drift. But before we go on, let us pause a moment and remember what kind of world it was in which this small town lived and died. For the year was 79, and it was, in many ways, a high and golden moment of the ancient world. The Roman Empire then stood at very nearly the height of its vast power. It stretched almost beyond imagining, from the cool green hills of Britain in the far north, all the way to the deserts of Egypt and Arabia, from the shores of the ocean in Spain to the rivers of Syria in the east. Hundreds of peoples and many millions of souls lived beneath the eagle of Rome, joined by her roads and her laws and her legions, in a great and largely peaceful whole such as the world had never seen before. And at the center of it all sat Rome herself, the greatest city on the earth, a teeming capital of perhaps 1 million people, of marble temples and towering apartment blocks, of emperors and senators and slaves. That very summer, as it happened, the old Emperor Vespasian had died, and his son Titus had just taken up the purple, a new emperor for a confident age. And in Rome, that very year, the mightiest building of the age was newly finished, the great amphitheater we now call the Colosseum, about to be opened with 100 days of games. It was an age that felt, to those who lived in it, permanent and secure and eternal. Rome had stood for centuries and would surely stand forever. The gods were in their temples, the legions on the frontiers, the ships upon the sea. And in this vast and settled world, Pompeii was nothing special at all. Only one of 1,000 comfortable little towns, of no great importance, that no history would ever have troubled to remember. And that, in the end, is exactly why it matters so much to us. For the emperors and their wars and their marble monuments are known to us well enough. But the ordinary daily life of ordinary Roman people, the bakers and the shopkeepers and the slaves, the meals and the shops and the scribbled jokes upon the walls, all of that would have vanished utterly, as it has vanished everywhere else, leaving barely a trace. Except here. except in this one small, unimportant town, which the mountain chose and kept. No one in all that mighty, confident empire could have dreamed that a little seaside town was about to meet a fate that would one day make its name more famous than Rome itself. For a little while in Pompeii, there was only fear and wonder, and no real understanding of what was to come. The people stood in the streets and stared up at the monstrous pillar of ash rising from the mountain, blotting out the sun. Some prayed. Some wept. Some simply stared. And then the sky began to fall. At first it fell as a fine gray ash, drifting down like a strange warm snow, settling on the rooftops and the streets and the upturned faces. And then, as the great cloud spread and thickened overhead, something heavier began to come down with it. Small stones. Little lumps of light, frothy, pale rock, no bigger than a pea at first, and then larger, the size of walnuts, then plums. This was pumice, the frozen froth of the mountain's molten heart, blasted so high into the air that it had cooled as it fell. It was light and full of holes, like a hard gray sponge. A single piece could not hurt you much. But it did not fall in single pieces. It fell in its millions, hour after hour, a ceaseless rattling rain of stone. It drummed upon the roof tiles, filled the gutters. It bounced and clattered along the paving stones. It gathered in the corners and against the walls, and slowly, steadily, it began to rise, deepening in the streets like a rising tide of stone, an inch and then a hand's breadth and then more. Let us try for a moment to feel what those first hours were like, for the people caught within them. Imagine the light first of all. When the great cloud had begun to rise, the sun still shone. But as the pillar of ash climbed and spread across the sky, the light began to change and to fail. The bright blue morning turned first to a strange yellow, and then to a dull and sickly brown, and the sun itself became a pale red disk that you could look upon without hurting your eyes, and then it dimmed further, and then it was gone. Imagine the sound. The ordinary music of the town, the splashing fountains, the calling voices, the rumble of carts, all of it was swallowed up now beneath two greater sounds. There was the deep and endless roar of the mountain itself, a sound like nothing any of them had ever heard, felt in the chest as much as heard in the ears. And over it, closer, all around, the ceaseless, maddening rattle and hiss of the falling stone, on the roofs, on the streets, on everything, that would not stop hour after hour after hour. Imagine the air. It grew thick and hard to breathe, full of fine gray dust that caught in the throat and stung the eyes. And upon it, growing stronger, came the smell of sulfur, sharp and foul, the very breath of the burning mountain, a smell that spoke to some deep and ancient part of the mind, of danger and of death. The birds had fallen silent or fled. The dogs whined and cowered or ran mad through the streets. And over everything lay a growing sense of unreality, of a world coming apart, of the ordinary rules of nature themselves being broken, in the middle of what had been, only hours before, a bright and perfectly ordinary summer day. And it did not stop. That, perhaps, was the hardest thing of all to bear. An earthquake is terrible, but it is over in a minute. A storm passes. But this went on and on and on. Hour after hour, the light did not return, and the roaring did not cease, and the stone did not stop falling, and the pile in the streets rose higher and higher. And with every passing hour, the terrible truth pressed harder upon the people of Pompeii, that this was not a passing storm at all, and that it might, perhaps, never end. Now the people of Pompeii faced the first and most terrible choice of that long day: to flee or to stay. And it was not at all an easy choice, for no one could know which was the path to safety and which the path to death. To flee meant to go out into the open, under that dreadful raining sky, where the falling stones struck the head and shoulders, where the air grew thick and hard to breathe, where the way was choked with fleeing crowds and darkness was coming on. To stay meant to shelter indoors under a solid roof and wait, and hope that the horror would pass, as the earthquake had passed 17 years before. Many chose to flee, and this, as it turned out, was the wiser choice, though they could not have known it. In those first hours, while the way was still open and the pumice not yet too deep, thousands of people gathered up what they could carry and hurried out through the gates, down toward the sea, and along the roads into the countryside, away from the mountain. They tied pillows and cushions upon their heads with cloth against the falling stones. They clutched their children and their money and their most precious things. They poured out of the town in a great frightened stream, coughing in the thickening air, stumbling in the deepening ash, glancing back in terror at the mountain that roared behind them. And most of those who left early and did not turn back and did not stop too soon lived. But many others chose to stay. And who can blame them? A person's home is their refuge, the place where they feel safe. To an old woman who could not walk far, to a mother with small children, to a merchant unwilling to abandon his goods, to a slave with nowhere to go, it seemed only sensible to shelter under a good roof and wait for the strange storm to end. So they closed their doors and gathered in the inner rooms and huddled together and listened to the endless rattling of the stone upon the roof and waited for it to stop. But it did not stop. Hour after hour after hour, it did not stop. And as the pumice piled higher and higher, a new and deadly danger grew for those who had stayed inside. For the light, frothy stone was piling up upon the roofs, deeper and deeper, heavier and heavier. A hand's depth, a knee's depth, a waist's depth, tons upon tons of it pressing down. And the roofs of Pompeii had not been built to bear such a weight. One by one, all across the town, as the hours passed, they began to give way. A beam would crack. A ceiling would sag. And then, with a roar, a roof would collapse inward, down upon the people sheltering beneath, who had thought themselves so safe. This, in the end, was how many of those who stayed would die that day, not from the ash, not yet from the fire, but crushed beneath their own falling roofs, or trapped in rooms whose doors were now blocked by mountains of stone that pressed against them from without. Let us pause among them a while, the people of that dreadful afternoon, and imagine some of the choices they made, for the diggers of later ages would find them where they fell, and we may guess a little at their stories. In the temple of Isis, the Egyptian goddess so beloved in Pompeii, the priests faced their own terrible hour. They gathered up the sacred treasures of the temple, the holy statues and the silver and the offerings, and fled with them through the raining dark, trying to save what was most precious to their faith. They did not get far. One of them was found to have taken shelter in a nearby building, and, as the pumice sealed the doors, to have broken through one wall, and then another with an axe room by room, seeking a way out until at last, in the final room, the way ran out and so did his life. We can still trace, in the broken walls, the path of his desperate hope. In the barracks of the gladiators, those famous fighting men, some had sheltered from the storm of stone. There they were found, a group of them together in one of the rooms. And there too, strangely, was found the body of a woman, richly dressed and adorned with fine jewelry, which set tongues wagging for centuries with romantic and scandalous tales of some great lady come to visit her gladiator love. The truth is almost certainly plainer and sadder, that she was simply one of many who ran into the nearest strong building to hide from the falling sky, and died there with the rest. But it reminds us that in that hour, the grand and the humble, the fine lady and the slave fighter, were all made equal by the mountain. All over the town, people were making their last small human decisions. A man gathered up a heavy bag of gold coins and his household keys, and set out, and got only as far as a garden before the end found him. A doctor took up his box of bronze medical instruments, thinking, perhaps, of the wounded he might help. In one great house, a family of many members, with their servants, gathered together and waited, and when at last they tried to flee across a garden, they died there together, adults and children, huddled in a little group among the vines, holding one another. A cast of them would one day be made, and it is among the most sorrowful things in all of Pompeii. Others would not leave their treasures. A wealthy household buried its silver, beautiful worked dishes and cups, hoping to return for it one day. It waited underground for nearly 1900 years. Still others carried nothing at all, only a child or an old parent upon their back, and fled with their lives as their single possession, and some of those were the ones who lived. Down at the harbor and along the shore, there was panic of another kind. Here were ships, and ships meant escape across the water away from the mountain. Crowds pressed down toward the sea, hoping to find a boat. But the sea had turned against them. It heaved and boiled, made wild and shallow and treacherous by the falling debris and the shaking earth, and the falling pumice rained down upon the water as thickly as upon the land. Few boats, if any, could put out safely into that madness. The sea, which had always been the road to safety, was closed. And out beyond the town, in the countryside, the farmers and country folk watched the horror from their fields and hillsides, safe for now upon the higher ground away from the falling ash, staring in terror at the mountain they had trusted all their lives, as it tore itself apart and buried the towns below beneath a churning sky. Some fled inland. Some stood and watched their whole world change. All of them would remember this day for as long as they lived, and tell of it to their children, and their children's children, until at last it passed into legend, and then into forgetting. Let us leave the town for a while now and cross the bay to the west, to the naval base at Misenum, where our two witnesses are watching the terror from afar. For it is thanks to one of them that we know so much of this day at all. You will remember old Pliny, the great scholar and admiral, and his young nephew staying with him. It was about the 7th hour of the day, a little past midday, when the boy's mother first pointed out the strange cloud to the old man. He had never seen its like, and being a man of endless curiosity, he called for a boat, so that he might sail closer and study it. But as he was about to set out, a message reached him. It was from a friend, a woman whose villa lay directly beneath the mountain, on that dangerous shore, and she was terrified and begged him to rescue her and her household, for there was no escape now except by sea. And here the old scholar became something greater than a scholar. He changed his plans at once. What he had begun in the spirit of curiosity, he now took up as a mission of rescue. He ordered out the warships of the fleet, the great galleys, and had them launched, and he himself went aboard, sailing straight toward the very heart of the disaster that everyone else was fleeing, to save as many as he could. His young nephew, 17 years old, chose to stay behind at Misenum with his studies. And so the boy lived, and grew to be a great man, and years later wrote down everything he had seen and heard, in 2 long letters, the only true eyewitness account of the destruction of Pompeii that has come down to us across all the centuries. Because a frightened boy stayed home and later took up his pen, we can stand in these streets today and know what happened. As the old admiral's ships drew near the shore beneath the mountain, the ash fell upon them hotter and thicker. Pumice and blackened stones rained down upon the decks. The sea itself grew shallow and choked, as debris fell into it, and the shore became impossible to approach. His helmsman begged him to turn back. But the old man would not turn back. Fortune favors the brave, he said, and ordered them onward to another part of the coast, to the town of Stabii, a little further along, where another friend of his was trapped and afraid. And there, at Stabii, he would go ashore. And there, as we shall see, he would meet his end. Meanwhile, over Pompeii, the afternoon was turning to something worse than night. The great cloud had spread across the whole sky, and beneath it the world grew dark, a deep, unnatural, terrifying darkness, in the middle of the day. It was not the soft darkness of evening. It was a total, smothering blackness, as the sun was blotted out entirely, and the only light was the dull red glow that sometimes flickered high on the mountain, and the sparks that fell hissing from the sky. Imagine it. Noon, and yet blacker than the blackest night. And still the stones came down, and still the ash thickened, and still the roofs groaned and fell. The people who remained in Pompeii were now trapped in a nightmare beyond anything they had words for. The streets were filling with stone, waist-deep, chest-deep, blocking the doors, burying the ground floors of the houses. The air was thick with dust and choking fumes. And over everything lay that impossible, world-ending dark. Many, realizing too late that to stay was death, now tried to flee after all, climbing out over the rising pumice, stumbling blind through the black and rattling streets, holding torches and lamps that the wind and the falling ash kept snuffing out. Some made it to the gates. Some found their way blocked or lost their courage or turned back for a loved one or a forgotten treasure and were never seen again. And so the long day wore into the long night, and the mountain roared on, tireless, merciless, and the doomed town lay gasping beneath its rain of stone and its blanket of terrible dark. The worst, though the people could not have imagined it, was still to come. Let us pass now into the long night of Pompeii, the strangest and most terrible night that town would ever know. It is a dark part of our story, but let it settle over you softly, for there is a kind of quiet in it too, and you are safe and warm and far away. Let us return first to old Pliny, the admiral, who had sailed his ships toward the disaster to rescue his friends, and had come ashore at Stabii, a little way along the coast. And here he gave the world one of the strangest examples of calm courage in all of history. For the old man, having reached his frightened friend, set himself entirely to soothing the household's fear. He behaved, his nephew tells us, as though nothing were wrong at all. He asked for a bath and took it. He asked for dinner and ate it cheerfully, or at least with a good show of cheer, so that the others might take heart from his composure. And then, most remarkably of all, the old man went to bed and fell asleep. He was heavy and elderly, and troubled with his breathing, and he slept deeply, and those passing his door could hear him snoring, while outside the mountain roared and the stones came down. But the danger was creeping close. All through the night the pumice fell, and the courtyard outside his room began to fill with it, higher and higher, until, had he slept much longer, he would not have been able to open his door at all. And so his companions woke him, and together they debated what to do. The house was shaking now with the great tremors that ran through the earth, rocking the walls as though they would fall. To stay indoors was to risk being buried alive or crushed beneath the collapsing roof. But to go out was to face the endless rain of falling stone. In the end, they chose to go out toward the shore, hoping to escape by sea. And they tied pillows upon their heads with cloths against the pumice and went out into the roaring dark. It was, by now, day again, somewhere far above the cloud, but here below it was still blacker than any night, a darkness deeper than a closed and shuttered room. They made their way to the shore by the light of torches and lamps, hoping to launch a boat. But the sea was wild and monstrous, heaving and impossible, and no ship could put out upon it. There, on the beach, The old admiral lay down upon a sailcloth that had been spread for him, weary and struggling for breath. He called once and then again for cold water and drank it. And around them on the mountain, the flames grew brighter, and a smell of sulfur, sharp and choking, drifted down upon them, sending the others fleeing. They roused him, and he tried to stand, leaning upon two of his slaves. And then, all at once, he fell down again. The thick and poisonous air, his nephew believed, had closed his weak old lungs. And there, upon the shore, in the dark, quietly, the great scholar died. When at last the daylight returned, 3 days later, they found his body where it had fallen, undamaged, untouched, still fully clothed. He looked, his nephew wrote, not like a dead man, but like one who was sleeping. He had sailed toward the disaster to save others, and it had cost him his life. And because his young nephew survived to tell the tale, the old man's death, alone of all the thousands who died that day, is remembered by name. Far away at Misenum that same night, the boy and his mother lived through their own terror. The earthquakes there grew so violent that the buildings seemed to be tearing loose from their foundations, rocking wildly to and fro. They fled the house, and out in the open a great crowd of panicked people streamed past them in the dark. And then they saw a thing of pure nightmare. Down at the shore, the sea was being sucked away, drawn back from the land as though the water were being pulled by some vast unseen force, leaving the seabed bare, and sea creatures stranded and flapping upon the sand. And behind the mountain, a huge black cloud was splitting with great forks and bursts of flame, and rolling down toward them across the water and the land. The crowd wailed and screamed in the darkness. Children cried for their parents, and parents for their children, feeling for one another by their voices in the black. Some prayed to the gods. And many, his nephew wrote, cried out that there were no gods anymore, and that this was the last eternal night, and that the whole world was dying with them, and would never see the light again. That is the thing to understand about that night. To the people living through it, it did not seem like a natural disaster, however terrible. It seemed like the end of the world. The sun was gone. The sky was falling. The sea had fled. The earth would not stop shaking. There was no light anywhere, and no reason to believe there ever would be again. It was, for them, quite simply the end of all things. Let us stay a little longer with the boy at Misenum, for his own account of that flight is one of the most vivid things to reach us from the whole of the ancient world, and it lets us feel from the inside what that night was like. Even as the danger grew, the young man tells us, he stubbornly went on with his reading and his notes, trying to seem calm. But at last the shaking of the earth grew so violent that it could no longer be ignored, and he and his mother left the house and sat down in the open, away from the buildings that threatened to fall. They tried to flee the town along the road, but a great terrified crowd came pressing behind them, and around them the ground heaved so wildly that the carts they had brought rolled this way and that upon the level ground, and would not stay still even when wedged with stones. They saw the sea drawn back upon itself, sucked away from the shore by the shuddering of the earth, so that many sea creatures lay stranded on the dry sand. And behind them, over the land, that dreadful black cloud came on, split with great flickering sheets of flame, and sinking down at last to the earth and the sea, and rolling toward them. The boy's mother, an older woman and heavy and slow, begged him to leave her and to save himself, for he was young and might yet outrun the death behind them. But he took her by the hand and made her come along with him, and would not hear of leaving her. He would not save his own life at the cost of hers. And so, hand in hand, mother and son, they hurried on through the gathering dark. And then the darkness came down upon them fully. Not the darkness of a moonless night, he wrote, but the blackness of a sealed room when the last lamp is put out. And in that blackness he could hear the sounds of the terrified crowd all around him. Women shrieking, children crying, men shouting. Some calling for their parents, some for their children, some for their husbands or wives, knowing them only by their voices in the dark. Some wept for their own doom. Some prayed for death, being so afraid of it. And many raised their hands to gods they no longer believed in, crying out that the gods were gone, and that this was the last, unending night of the world. Ash was falling on them now, thick and heavy, and again they had to rise and shake it off, or be buried where they sat. A dull and dreadful glow appeared, not daylight, but the light of the fires on the mountain drawing near. And then, at last, the blackness began to thin, and to fade into a kind of smoke or mist, and then, wonder of wonders, the real daylight returned, pale and sickly and yellow, as in an eclipse. And they looked upon a world transformed. Everything, as far as they could see, was buried deep in gray ash, as a landscape is buried in snow, silent and strange and changed beyond knowing. They had lived. The boy and his mother had lived to make their weary way home at last across that ash-choked land, not knowing yet whether the old admiral, the boy's uncle, still lived or no. And because that frightened boy survived and grew up, and years afterward set down every detail of that night in his careful, honest letters, we can stand here 19 centuries later and know it too. It is a strange kind of immortality to have lived through the worst night of the world, and by simply writing it down to have made it live forever. And in Pompeii itself, buried now beneath many feet of stone, the last hours of the trapped and the doomed were passing in that same absolute dark. Let us be gentle here, for these were real people, as real as you or I, and their courage and their love in that final night deserve our quiet respect. Families huddled together in the upper rooms of their houses, the only rooms not yet filled with pumice, clinging to one another, listening to the roofs groan and the walls crack. Some held their children close and told them, surely, that it would soon be over, that the light would return, that all would be well. Some prayed to their small household gods. Some wept. Some, perhaps, were past all weeping and simply waited, numb, in the dark. Here and there a lamp still burned, a tiny point of gold in all that blackness, until the thickening air, or the wind of the falling stone, put it out. The hours crawled by, longer than any hours had ever been, and there was no dawn, and no end, only the endless rattle of the stone, and the shaking of the earth and the dark. Some, in those hours, made a last desperate attempt to escape. They gathered up their gold and their jewels and their keys, and climbed out over the deep pumice, and tried to feel their way through the buried streets toward the gates and the open country. A few, even now, may have made it out, but many did not. They were found centuries later in little groups, along the streets and against the walls, their treasures still clutched in their hands, cut down at last not by the falling stone, but by the thing that came in the darkness before the dawn. Let us not pass too quickly over these people, huddled in the dark. For there is something in the way they were found all those centuries later that speaks of the very best of what we are, even in the very worst of hours. Again and again, the diggers found them not alone, but together, in little clusters, families in one room, a group of friends or servants in another, people who, in the last hours of the world, sought out one another and held on and did not die alone. They were found with their arms around each other, parents shielding children, the strong holding up the weak. Someone, it seems, had stayed behind to help an old man who could not walk. Someone had gone back into the dark for a person they loved, when they might have saved themselves. In that final, hopeless night, when the gods had fallen silent and the world seemed to be ending, these ordinary people did not, for the most part, turn on one another or trample the weak or scatter each to his own escape. They gathered close, and they comforted one another, and they faced the dark together. There is a kind of quiet glory in that, worth remembering and worth carrying with you towards sleep. And there is a strange gentleness, too, in how it ended for them, though they could not have known it was coming. After the long terror of that night, after the hours of falling stone and shaking earth and absolute dark, the end itself, when it came in a single instant swifter than fear. Whatever they suffered in the waiting, they did not suffer in the passing. One moment they were there holding one another in the dark, and the next, very gently, they were gone and at peace and beyond all fear forever. We do not know their names, most of them. We do not know their stories, their loves, their small hopes and disappointments, the ordinary shape of the lives they lived before that day. But we know that they were here. We know that they loved one another. And we know that, at the end, they were not alone. And somehow, across all the long centuries, that feels like enough to hold on to and to lay down softly as the night deepens. For as that long night drew toward its close, the mountain changed the manner of its killing. Through all the hours of dark, it had rained down stone and ash, burying the town, crushing and trapping and choking. But now it prepared to do something faster and hotter and even more terrible. And it is to that final, merciful, dreadful hour that we must now gently turn. All through that long night, the great column of ash had stood in the sky, a pillar many miles high, held up by the sheer force of the gas roaring out of the mountain. But such a thing cannot stand forever. As the eruption went on, the column began at times to falter and to fall. And when a column like that falls, it does not drift gently down. Collapses. All that unimaginable weight of ash and stone and searing gas, no longer held aloft, comes crashing back down upon the mountain, and then rushes outward, down the slopes, hugging the ground, a boiling avalanche of superheated cloud moving faster than a galloping horse, faster than the wind. We have a name for it now, a name the Romans never knew. We call it a pyroclastic surge, a flow of fire. It is a cloud of ash and gas heated to many hundreds of degrees, dense and low and impossibly swift, sweeping across the land, destroying utterly everything in its path. It is the deadliest thing a volcano can do. And in the last hours of that night, Vesuvius sent surge after surge racing down toward the sleeping, buried towns. The first of them did not strike Pompeii. They rushed down the western slope, toward the sea, toward the other, smaller, richer town that lay closer beneath the mountain, the town of Herculaneum. Herculaneum had, in a way, been more fortunate at first. The wind that first afternoon had carried the falling ash away from it, toward Pompeii, so that while Pompeii was being buried in stone, Herculaneum lay almost untouched. Its people had time, and most of them wisely had fled. Many of them fled to the shore, down to the seafront, where there stood a row of great stone arches, boathouses opening onto the beach. And there hundreds of them gathered, men, women, and children, huddled together in those stone chambers, waiting for the boats that would carry them to safety across the water. They waited through the long dark night. And the boats did not come, or could not come, across that raging sea. And there, in those arches, in the deep of the night, the first great surge found them. It swept down off the mountain and over the town and across the shore in an instant, a wall of gas hundreds of degrees hot. For the people sheltering in the boathouses, death came faster than thought, faster than fear, in a single searing moment. It is believed they died instantly, before they could even understand what was upon them. They were found there, those hundreds of people, huddled together in the stone arches by the sea, nearly 2,000 years later, their skeletons still clustered as they had gathered in life, mothers with children in their arms, a soldier with his sword, a young man, a baby. For centuries it had been thought that the people of Herculaneum had escaped. And then, in our own time, the diggers opened the arches and found them all still there, waiting on the shore for boats that never came. It is worth pausing on that discovery, for it is one of the most haunting in all the long history of Pompeii and its sister town. For a very long time, hardly any human remains had been found at Herculaneum at all, and scholars had supposed, and hoped, that its people had gotten safely away. Then, only a few decades ago, the the diggers reached down at last to the level of the ancient seafront, buried far below the modern town, and opened those stone boat chambers. And there they were, hundreds of them. The people who had not escaped after all, but had come down to the shore and taken shelter and waited for rescue through the long night until the fiery cloud found them. And because they had been sheltered within the stone arches and killed in an instant and then sealed away, they were preserved with terrible completeness. Archaeologists could study the very bones and read in them the stories of these people's lives. Here was a woman, richly adorned with rings of gold and emerald, whom they came to call the Ring Lady, her jewels still upon her fingers. Here was a man who seemed, from his sword and his belt and his fine tools, to have been a soldier fallen face down upon the sand. Here were mothers still cradling infants and children, and the old and the young gathered together at the water's edge. And near them, upon the ancient beach, lay the remains of a great overturned boat that might, had there only been time, have carried some of them away. The heat of the cloud that killed them had been so ferocious, the scientists could tell, that death had come to every one of them in a single instant, faster than pain, faster than fear. Whatever they had suffered in the waiting, they were spared any suffering in the end. They had come down to the sea and looked out across the dark water for the boats that would save them, and in one bright, searing moment, together they were gone. And then it was Pompeii's turn. In the darkness before the dawn, after that endless night of falling stone, the surges at last came for the greater town. They swept over the walls and poured through the buried streets, a scorching black cloud rolling across everything, and in a moment, a single moment, it was over. For everyone still alive in Pompeii, and after that long night there were still many sheltering in the upper rooms, clinging to life and to one another, the end came in an instant and without warning and, we may believe, very nearly without pain. The searing heat of the surge killed in a moment. Whatever terror they had endured through the long night, their final passing was swift. And that is why, when at last the town was uncovered, the people were found not scattered and broken, but frozen exactly as they had been in that last instant of life. The surge killed them, and then the ash that came behind it settled over them, gently, deeply, and held them and kept them, in the very posture of their final moment, for 1700 years. Through the rest of that dreadful morning, surge after surge, and a final deep fall of ash, buried what was left of the two towns, deeper and deeper, until they were gone entirely. When the mountain at last fell silent, some 2 days after it had begun, Pompeii lay beneath many feet of hardened ash and stone. Herculaneum lay even deeper, buried beneath the flows that had swept over it. The very shape of the world had changed. The coastline had moved outward, the sea pushed back by all the debris. The river had shifted its course. The green and pleasant mountain was green no longer, but a gray and broken ruin, its whole top blasted away. And of the bright and busy towns that had stood that morning in the sun, there was, upon the surface of the earth, nothing left to see at all. Only a vast, gray, silent, smoking waste, flat and featureless, from horizon to horizon. When the survivors crept back, in the days that followed, they could not even find their homes. There were no streets, no landmarks, no familiar corners, nothing but the endless gray. Somewhere beneath their feet lay everything they had known, their houses, their temples, their forum, their dead. But it was gone, sealed away, unreachable. Some, we are told, dug down through the ash, searching for lost loved ones or buried valuables, tunneling into the tops of buildings they could no longer see. And then, in time, even they gave up and went away. Word of the disaster reached Rome, and the young emperor, Titus, did what he could. He sent officials and money to help the survivors and the wider region. He came himself to see the devastation twice and gave generously from the imperial treasury, and appointed men to see to the relief of all who had lost their homes and their livelihoods. He behaved, the historians tell us, not like a distant ruler, but like a grieving father to his stricken people, and they loved him for it. For it must be said, and it is a comfort worth holding on to, that not everyone died. Far from it. Of the many thousands who had lived in Pompeii and Herculaneum and the towns around, a great number, perhaps most, had fled in those first hours while the way was still open and had lived. They lost everything they owned, their homes, their businesses, their whole world. But they kept their lives. And they began again as people do. They gathered in the towns nearby that had been spared, and they made new homes and found new work and raised their children and grew old. Here and there, in the records of other towns, the names of Pompeian families turn up in the years that followed, quiet proof that they had lived on and carried their town's memory with them. The story of Pompeii is not only a story of death. It is also a story of survival of ordinary people who lost everything and endured and went on. There is a kind of hope in that, too. As for the young emperor, Titus, the disaster of Vesuvius fell upon him almost the moment he took the throne, and it proved only the first of his sorrows. For the very next year, a great fire swept through the heart of Rome itself, burning for 3 days and destroying temples and monuments beyond counting. And hard upon the fire came a plague, one of the worst the city had ever known. It was as though the gods had turned their faces from Rome. And through it all, the young emperor gave and gave and gave, stripping his own palaces of their treasures to pay for the rebuilding and the relief, and winning, in his short time, a name for kindness that outlasted him. But his time was short indeed. After a reign of just over 2 years, Titus fell ill of a fever and died, still a young man, mourned by the people he had served so well. His brother took the throne after him. And the vast machine of the empire rolled on, as empires do, and the memory of a small buried town by the bay faded, year by year into the past, and then out of it altogether. And then, slowly, the world moved on and began to forget. The gray waste in time weathered and settled. Rain fell. Seeds took root in the volcanic soil, which was, as it had always been, wonderfully rich. Grass grew, and then bushes, and then trees. Vineyards climbed once more upon the slopes. Farmers plowed the land above the buried town, never knowing what lay beneath their furrows. The centuries passed, one upon another. The Roman Empire itself grew old and faltered and fell. New peoples came. The very language of the land changed. And Pompeii slept on, unseen, unremembered, beneath the fields and the vineyards. In time, even its name was lost. A place near the buried town came to be called, by the local country folk, simply the city La Civita, as though some faint memory lingered that something had once stood there. But no one knew what. No one knew that a whole world lay sleeping just below. For 1700 years, Pompeii lay in the dark, held in the ash, waiting. Empires rose and fell above it. And all the while, just beneath the surface, the loaves still sat in the ovens, and the paintings still glowed upon the walls, and the people still lay where they had fallen, on that last bright morning so long ago. And then, at last, the world remembered. Let this be the gentler turn of our story now, as the long night ends, and the buried town begins slowly to return to the light. It began really by accident. In the 1700s, the kings who then ruled that part of Italy grew interested in the ancient statues and treasures that were sometimes turned up by wells and digging in the area. First, the deeper town of Herculaneum was tunneled into, and then, in the year 1748, workmen digging near La Civita began to uncover walls and paintings and objects, and, at last, the truth. The lost city had been found. The story of Herculaneum's rediscovery had come first, and it is a curious one. Early in the 1700s, a farmer digging a well had struck, deep underground, the marble seats of an ancient theater, without in the least understanding what he had found. Years later, a prince heard of it, and set men to tunnel down through the many feet of rock-hard volcanic stone that sealed the buried town. It was brutal, dangerous work, hacking narrow shafts and galleries through the darkness, far below the modern fields and houses. And what those tunnels found astonished the world. For Herculaneum, buried deeper and hotter than Pompeii, had been preserved in a different and even more remarkable way. The heat and the airless depth had carbonized the organic things that anywhere else would have rotted away to nothing. Wooden furniture survived, chairs and beds and doors and shelves, turned to black carbon but whole. Loaves of bread survived. Even in one house, a baby's wooden cradle that could still be gently rocked. And in one great seaside villa, the diggers found the most precious thing of all, though at first they did not know it. They found a library. Row upon row of ancient scrolls, hundreds upon hundreds of them, the private book collection of a wealthy Roman household. But the scrolls had been carbonized by the heat, turned to fragile black cylinders, like lumps of charcoal, so brittle that they crumbled at a touch. We call that house to this day the Villa of the Papyri after those scrolls. It is the only library to survive from the entire ancient world, the only one buried and burned and kept. For centuries, those blackened scrolls could not be read at all. To try to unroll them was to destroy them. They sat in a museum, silent, holding their lost words, ancient books that no living eye could ever open. And yet, in our own time, there is hope. For clever people with powerful scanning machines and computers have begun, at last, to peer inside those charred scrolls without ever unrolling them, and to tease out, letter by letter, the words that have been sealed in darkness for 2,000 years. Slowly, gently, the lost library of Herculaneum is beginning, once more, to speak. Back at Pompeii, meanwhile, the digging went on year after year, and the buried town rose slowly back into the light. And as it did, all of Europe fell in love with it. Kings and scholars and artists journeyed south to marvel at the wonders coming out of the ash. The elegant paintings, the graceful furniture, the whole recovered vision of how the ancients had truly lived, swept through the taste of the age like a fresh wind. Artists began to paint in the Pompeian manner. Fine houses were decorated in the new old style. The rediscovery of these buried towns helped to spark a great fashion across all of Europe for the clean and noble beauty of the classical world. At first, it must be said, they dug for treasure, not for knowledge. The early diggers hunted for statues and fine paintings and gold to adorn the palaces of kings, and were careless of much else. But as the years and the decades passed, and more of the town emerged, people began to understand what an extraordinary thing they had found. Not just treasure. A whole city. A whole world. Frozen in a single moment and preserved as no other place on earth had ever been preserved. For that is the strange and wondrous gift that the disaster left behind. The very thing that destroyed Pompeii also saved it. The ash that buried the town also sealed it and protected it and kept it almost perfectly for all those centuries. Elsewhere, the ancient world crumbled and rotted and was built over and lost. But here, beneath the ash, an entire Roman town lay waiting. Its streets, its houses, its shops, its paintings, its bread, its graffiti, the very furniture of daily life, held safe in the dark. To walk through Pompeii, as millions now do, is to walk through a Roman town as it truly was, not a ruin of a few grand monuments, but a whole living place with its main streets and its back alleys, its grand villas and its humble shops, its bakeries with the millstones still standing, its bars with the jars still set in the counters, its walls still bright with painting and scrawled with the idle words of people 2,000 years dead. Nowhere else on earth can we so simply, so completely, step back into the ancient world. Let us wander for a little while through some of the wonders that the ash gave back. Come first to the grandest of the houses, the House of the Faun, that palace we spoke of earlier, spreading over an entire block of the town. On its floor was found a mosaic so vast and so magnificent that it is counted among the greatest works of art to survive from all antiquity. Made of more than 1,000,000 tiny pieces of colored stone, it shows a great battle, the young conqueror Alexander the Great charging into the fray against the king of Persia. Faces full of fury and fear, horses rearing, spears bristling. That one floor in one house, in one small town, holds a masterpiece that the whole world now treasures. Come next to the house of the Bedtime, the home of two brothers, former slaves who had grown rich as merchants, and who spent their new fortune adorning their house with some of the loveliest paintings in all of Pompeii. Its walls glow still with slender figures and delicate garlands, and around one room runs a charming painted frieze of little winged cupids, busy at all the trades of the town, making perfume, selling wine, working gold, as though the children of the gods were playing at being the people of Pompeii. Come to the house of the tragic poet with that famous mosaic in its doorway, the chained dog, and beneath it the two words that everyone remembers, cave canem, beware of the dog. Come to the many houses whose garden walls were painted with wonderful skill to look like real gardens, so that a small courtyard seemed to open onto endless greenery, with birds and fountains and flowers and trees, a whole imaginary paradise upon a wall. And come, at the last, beyond the town walls, to a great villa that holds the most mysterious paintings of all, the Villa of the Mysteries. Around the walls of one room there runs a series of large and glorious paintings, life-sized figures against a deep and burning red, showing what seems to be some secret religious ceremony, a ritual of an ancient mystery cult, its meaning half hidden from us still. A young woman is being led, step by step, through the strange and solemn stages of the rite. We do not fully understand what we are seeing, but the beauty and the power of those figures, glowing on their red walls after 2,000 years, is something no one who sees them ever forgets. Everywhere, the paintings and the objects tell us how these people lived. We see what they ate, from the very foods found upon their tables and in their shops. We read their politics in the hundreds of election notices painted on their walls, urging votes for this candidate or that, some of them cheekily signed by the man's supposed supporters, the sneak thieves, or the late drinkers, or the whole company of those who are still awake. We see their loves and their quarrels and their jokes, scratched as graffiti on every surface. We even glimpse their faith in their many gods and in the newer Eastern religions that had begun to reach the town, the worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis, whose temple stood in Pompeii, and perhaps, just perhaps, in one or two puzzling scratches on a wall, the very faintest early whisper of the Christians. It is all there. A whole civilization, not summarized in a history book, but caught alive, in its own words and its own paint and its own daily things, in the moment it was struck down. And yet, of all of it, one kind of discovery moves us more than any painting or palace or mosaic. But of all the discoveries at Pompeii, the most haunting, the most human, the one that reaches straight into the heart, came from a clever idea in the 1800s. For as the diggers worked through the hardened ash, they kept coming upon strange hollow spaces, empty voids in the solid gray. A man named Giuseppe Fiorelli, who took charge of the excavations, understood at last what these hollows were. When the people of Pompeii had died and been buried in the ash, their bodies, over the long centuries, had slowly decayed away to nothing. but the ash around them had set hard, like plaster, holding the exact shape of each body before it vanished. Each hollow was the perfect mold of a human being in the very instant of their death. And so Fiorelli had a wonderful and a terrible idea. When his diggers found such a hollow, they would gently pour liquid plaster into it and let it set, and then carefully chip away the ash around it. And what emerged out of the gray into the light was the exact form of a person in their final moment 17 centuries before. And oh, what they saw! They are not statues, these casts, not carvings made by an artist's hand. They are the true shapes of real people in the very posture in which they died. A mother lying over her small child, shielding it with her body to the last. A man sitting with his head in his hands. A couple lying together, reaching for one another. A young girl, resting her head upon her arm, as though only sleeping. People with the folds of their clothing still visible, the expression sometimes still upon their faces. And most famously of all, a dog. A poor guard dog, chained in a doorway, who could not flee as the ash rose around him, and who died there, twisted, straining against his chain, and whose empty shape, filled with plaster, shows him still, forever in that last struggle. It is impossible to look upon these casts and not feel your heart turn over. For here they are. Not history in a book. The people themselves. Reaching out to us across all the long centuries, from the last moment of their lives. We look at them and we do not see grand emperors or famous heroes. We see a mother, a father, a child, a frightened man, a faithful dog. We see, in short, ourselves. And that is why, of everything that has come out of the ash, it is these silent gray figures that visitors remember longest, and that reach across the centuries to touch us most deeply of all. And all around these people, the ash preserved the whole ordinary substance of their days, in a completeness found nowhere else on earth. We know, from what was left upon their tables and in their shops, exactly what they ate: bread and cheese and olives and figs and fish and eggs and honeyed wine. We know the games they played, from the dice and the counters and the game boards scratched into the paving of the forum, where idle men gambled away the afternoon. We know their pets and their beasts of burden, and the very plants that grew in their gardens, from the shapes their roots left in the earth. Above all, we know their words, for the people of Pompeii wrote on everything. Their walls are a vast and living chatter of ordinary human voices. A man writes proudly that he dined very well. A lover writes the name of his sweetheart inside a painted heart. A disappointed soul complains of an innkeeper who watered down the wine. Someone wishes good health to a friend and hopes that, wherever she may be, she will sneeze sweetly. A weary teacher, a proud tradesman, a lovesick boy, a bragging drunkard, all of them left their small marks, and all of them still speak. And their politics live on too, in the hundreds of election notices painted in bold red letters along the main streets, for the town was in the very midst of its local elections when the end came. "Vote for this good man," they cry, "he will keep the streets clean, he is worthy of public office." And some are gently mischievous, endorsements supposedly written by the town's pickpockets, or its runaway slaves, or the whole brotherhood of those who sleep all day, a little joke at a candidate's expense that has kept its humor for 2,000 years. It is this more than the gold and the marble that makes Pompeii so precious and so strangely dear. It gives us not the Rome of the history books, but the Rome of the ordinary Tuesday. It lets us stand in a real Roman street and read a real Roman joke and know that these people, so impossibly far away in time, laughed at the same silly things and loved the same small pleasures and worried over the same daily cares as we do tonight. And Pompeii has given the living one more gift, a quieter one, that the dead of that day could never have imagined. For in studying the buried towns and the great layers of ash and stone that covered them, the scholars of later ages slowly learned to read the story of the eruption itself, hour by hour, layer by layer, as one might read the pages of a book. They could see, in the depths of the ash, the long night of falling stone, and then, above it, the deadly marks of the surges that ended it all. And when they compared what the ground told them with what the young Pliny had written so long ago, the two accounts matched with astonishing precision. The frightened boy had recorded, faithfully and well, the very thing the science would confirm 2,000 years later. In honor of that, the scientists who study volcanoes gave his name to this kind of eruption, the towering column, the rain of pumice, the collapse, and the killing surge. They call it, to this day, a Plinian eruption. His uncle sailed toward the disaster and died. The boy watched and remembered and wrote. And because of them, a whole science was helped into being, the science of understanding these mountains of fire, and of learning to read the warnings, and to carry people to safety before the blow falls. So the dead of Pompeii did not die for nothing. Their terrible end, studied and understood, has taught us to save the living. When a volcano stirs today, somewhere across the world, and the people are led away in time, and their lives are spared, a part of that wisdom was born here, in this quiet town, from these silent dead. It is a strange and beautiful thought that the people of Pompeii, lost so long ago, should still be reaching out a hand to protect us now. And that, in the end, is the strange and precious meaning of Pompeii. It is a place of death, yes, a town of the dead, killed in a single dreadful day. But it is also, and above all, a place of life, the most perfectly preserved picture of ordinary human life that the ancient world has left us. Because of that terrible morning, we know the Romans not as distant figures of marble and legend, but as people. We know what they ate for lunch and what they scribbled on their walls and how they decorated their homes and what made them laugh and whom they loved. We know their bakers by name and their politicians and their dogs. A whole living world that would otherwise have vanished utterly was caught and held for us in the ash by the same disaster that destroyed it. And there is a lesson in it, I think, though a quiet one, worth carrying with you into sleep. The people of Pompeii were exactly like us. They rose that morning with their small plans and their ordinary worries. They thought about their work and their meals and their families and the little troubles of the day. They had no idea that it was their last morning. No one ever does. And so their story is, in a way, a gentle reminder to treasure the ordinary day. The warm bread, the familiar street, the voices of the people we love, the plain and priceless business of an ordinary life. The people of Pompeii had all of that on that last bright morning by the sea. And because a mountain remembered them, so now do we. And what of the mountain itself, that green and pleasant giant that ended their world? It is still there. It stands to this day above the Bay of Naples, quiet again, its slopes green again, as beautiful as ever it was. But it is not dead. It only sleeps as it slept before, and it has woken many times since that terrible year. Again and again over the long centuries, Vesuvius has stirred and erupted, sometimes gently, sometimes with great violence. There was a mighty eruption some 400 years ago that killed thousands. There have been others since, on into modern times, the last of them within living memory, during the Great World War of the last century, when the fire on the mountain lit up the night for the soldiers passing below. And then, once more, it fell quiet. And it is quiet now. But here is the sobering truth. Vesuvius is counted among the most dangerous volcanoes on the whole Earth, not because it is the largest, but because of what now lies around it. For the land at its feet, the same rich and fertile land that drew the Romans, is today one of the most crowded places in all of Europe. Where 15,000 people once lived in Pompeii, there now live some 3 million, in a great sprawling city and its towns, spread right up the slopes of the sleeping mountain. And one day, no one knows when, in 10 years or 100 or 1,000, it will wake again. The people who study such things watch it always and wait, and hope that when it comes, there will be time enough to flee. There is something in that, is there not, to think upon quietly as you drift towards sleep. That the same beautiful, generous, deadly mountain still stands there in the dark tonight, above the lights of the living city, keeping its ancient and patient watch, as it kept it over Pompeii, on that last warm evening 2,000 years ago. And Pompeii itself is not yet fully uncovered, even now. After nearly 300 years of digging, something like a third of the town still lies buried under the ash, untouched, its streets and houses and secrets, and perhaps its people, still sleeping in the dark where the mountain laid them. And those who care for the town have chosen, wisely, to leave much of it so sealed and safe beneath the earth, for the diggers of some future age, who may have gentler tools and greater wisdom than our own. So a part of Pompeii sleeps still, and will go on sleeping, patient in the ash, as it has slept for so very long. From the moment it returned to the light, Pompeii has held the imagination of the world as few places ever have. Ever since those first diggings, poets have written of it, and painters have painted it, imagining the terror of that last day, the red sky, the fleeing crowds, the mountain in its fury. Nearly 200 years ago, An English writer set a famous novel amid the town's final hours, and its title, The Last Days of Pompeii, has echoed down the years ever since, a phrase that means, to us all, a doomed and unknowing world enjoying its final golden afternoon. In later times, the story was told again and again, in paintings and books, and, in our own age, in films, that great cloud rising over the little town having become one of the most familiar images of doom in all the world. And still, to this day, the people come. Every year, millions upon millions of visitors from every corner of the earth make their way to that quiet ruin by the bay, and walk its ancient streets, and stand in its silent houses, and gaze upon its casts, and fall quiet. It is among the most visited places on the whole planet, and yet, for all the crowds, there is a hush that falls upon people there, a sense of standing somewhere sacred, somewhere that asks to be spoken of softly. Why does it hold us so? Other cities have died. Other disasters have killed far more. And yet none grips the heart quite like Pompeii. Perhaps it is the sheer completeness of it, the way a whole world was caught and kept, so that we do not merely read about these people but stand in their very rooms. Perhaps it is the casts, the people themselves, present to us as the dead of no other age can be. Or perhaps it is something simpler and closer to home. Perhaps it is that, in Pompeii, we see ourselves. For their last day was so very like our own days. So ordinary. So full of small plans and small pleasures, and the quiet, unspoken assumption that tomorrow would come, as it always had. They rose and washed and ate their breakfast and went about their work and thought about their dinner and their debts and their children and the games at the weekend. And they were wrong, all of them, about the one thing none of us can ever truly know, which is how much time we have. There is no need to let that thought frighten you. Here in the warmth and the dark, as sleep draws near. Let it, instead, be gentle. For if the people of Pompeii teach us anything, across their 2,000 years of silence, it is not to fear the mountain. It is to love the ordinary day, to notice the warm bread and the morning light and the familiar street and the voices of the people we love. To understand that these small and common things, so easily overlooked, are in truth the whole of the treasure. The people of Pompeii had all of it that last bright morning. And so tonight, do you? The loaves are still in the oven. The paintings still glow upon the walls. And the people of Pompeii, who woke one summer morning almost 2,000 years ago and never saw the evening, are remembered still and always will be, for as long as there are those who come to walk their quiet streets, and to wonder and to care. And now the tale is told, and there is nothing left to do but rest. So let the great mountain fall silent in your mind, and let the gray ash settle, soft and deep and still, over the whole long story, until all is quiet. You have traveled a long way tonight, from a bright and busy town full of life, through a night of fire and darkness, to a silence that lasted 1,700 years, and out again into the gentle light of remembrance. And now that journey is done, and you may lay it down. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let every thought soften and blur and drift away into the dark, like ash settling on a quiet field. There is nothing to hold on to and nothing to fear. All is still. All is well. You are safe and it is time to rest. Sleep now. The lamp is burning low. The long story is over, and the night will keep you gently until morning. Sleep and rest and be at peace. Good night. From all of us here at Lamplight History, good night.